The music teacher forces the blind girl to play the violin to humiliate her, but the girl shocks everyone. The small town of Maplewood, Ohio, greeted Emily and her mother with a quiet stillness that seemed to stretch for miles beyond the horizon. Narrow streets, framed by rows of tall, swaying oaks, led them past red brick houses with white fences and tidy gardens. Emily sat silently in the passenger seat, listening carefully to every subtle sound, the crunch of gravel beneath the way, cartires, the gentle rustling of the trees, and the faint hum of distant wind chimes swaying softly. Without her sight, these details painted a vivid picture of this unfamiliar world. Since the death of her father 6 months ago, Emily's life had become a series of blurred transitions. First the sharp, numbing shock of loss, then the chaotic process of selling their old home in Cleveland, and now settling into a town neither she nor her mother had ever visited before. Her mother had assured her that the fresh start would help them both heal, but to Emily it felt more like starting all over with half the pieces missing. Their new house stood at the corner of Willow Street, modest and slightly worn, yet holding an air of quiet charm. Emily's mother guided her carefully up the short walkway, describing the creaky steps, the weathered porch swing, and the scent of lavender from the neighboring garden. Inside, the house smelled of freshly cleaned wood and faintly of old books, a detail Emily instantly appreciated. School was set to begin the following day, and as night fell, Emily sat by her window, fingertips tracing the patterns on the curtain fabric while she listened to the distant laughter of children playing under the glow of streetlights. She wondered if any of them would be her classmates. A tight knot formed in her stomach, as it always did when she thought about meeting new people. Would they stare? Would they whisper? Would they understand that being blind did not mean being incapable? The following morning arrived too soon. Emily stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her simple blue dress, knowing she couldn't see her reflection, but wanting to feel presentable nonetheless. Her mother braided her long brown hair just as her father used to do before every important day, making sure to tuck in the ribbon he had given her on her 12th birthday. The ribbon was now a fragile yet precious memory woven into her daily life. As they drove to Maplewood High School, Emily could hear the distant chatter of students filling the front yard. The sound was both familiar and overwhelming. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "You are stronger than you think," she whispered, before leading her toward the front office. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of coffee and paperwork. The receptionist greeted them warmly, guiding Emily through the registration process. Despite the kindness, Emily could sense the subtle tension whenever someone noticed the white cane resting against her chair. No matter how often she experienced it, the unspoken pity always managed to sting. When it was time for the tour, a student volunteer named Olivia was assigned to show Emily around. Olivia spoke kindly but with an edge of hesitation, as if unsure of how to act around someone who couldn't see. Emily had long grown used to these interactions and did her best to reassure Olivia by smiling and making light conversation. The school felt like a maze, with hallways echoing with footsteps and lockers slamming shut in quick succession. Olivia described each turn and classroom with impressive detail, but it was the music room that made Emily pause. The moment Olivia opened the door, Emily's senses were flooded with the distinct scent of polished wood, rosin, and aged sheet music. The faint sound of a piano being played somewhere nearby made her heart beat faster. Music had always been Emily's refuge. Ever since she was a child, the piano had been her most trusted companion. She could lose herself for hours, letting melodies carry her beyond the limitations imposed by her blindness. Yet today, standing on the threshold of a new music room, uncertainty crept in. Would she find the same solace here? Would this place accept her as she was? Later that evening, as Emily lay in bed listening to the chirping of crickets, the questions circled endlessly in her mind. The emptiness left by her father's absence seemed louder than usual. He had been the one who believed unconditionally in her talent. His voice would often echo in her thoughts, telling her that music was not something you needed to see. It was something you needed to feel. With every passing second, the realization sank deeper. Tomorrow, she would meet her new music teacher. What would he be like? Would he, like others, immediately doubt her capabilities just because she was blind? Or would he see the musician within her? Emily clung to a small thread of hope, the same hope that had carried her through the darkest days since losing her father. As she drifted into a restless sleep, Emily could still hear the faint notes from the music room replaying in her mind, weaving into her dreams. Unbeknownst to her, those notes were only the beginning of a journey that would test not just her talent, but her courage, resilience, and the unwavering power of her spirit. Maplewood had no idea who had just arrived, and neither did Emily. But the echoes of her father's words followed her gently into the night. Music is not seen, it is felt. And Emily was about to show them all just how deeply she could feel. The corridors of Maplewood High buzzed with restless energy as students hurried to their first classes. Locker doors clattered open and shut like percussion instruments, marking the rhythm of the morning. Emily walked carefully beside Olivia, counting her steps instinctively as she had always done in unfamiliar spaces. Each sound served as a landmark, painting the contours of the school within her mind. Yet despite her focused demeanor, inside she wrestled with unease. The music classroom door loomed ahead, a doorway not only into a physical space, but into the unknown. As Olivia pushed open the door, Emily was greeted by the mingled scents of varnished instruments, sheet music, and the sharp tang of brass polish. The room was larger than she imagined, its acoustics carrying even the softest murmurs to every corner. A hush fell over the students already seated as they noticed Emily stepping in. Her cane tapped lightly against the tiled floor, marking her arrival with an unmistakable presence. From the far end of the room, Mr. Collins looked up from his cluttered desk. Tall, rigid, and dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, he possessed an air of authority that made the room itself seem to straighten its back. He adjusted his glasses and took in the sight of Emily, eyes narrowing slightly. The silence thickened as if the room itself anticipated his reaction. "Oh well," he said, his voice sharp and unsparing. "I see we have a new student. Emily, is it?" His tone held none of the usual warmth teachers often extended to newcomers. It was clinical, evaluative. "I hope you understand that music. Class here is no easy ride." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. She could hear the shuffle of students turning in their seats to watch her. Every movement, every hesitant breath felt amplified. "Yes, sir," she managed to reply. Mr. Collins continued, undeterred. "You are aware that this is not a hobby club? We don't simply make noise for amusement. We work hard and we aim for perfection. I expect nothing less from every student." He let the words hang deliberately, making sure Emily absorbed them. The teacher's gaze swept across the room before landing back on her. "Take a seat," he ordered without offering assistance. Olivia, visibly uncomfortable, quickly guided Emily to an empty chair near the back. Emily sat, fingers brushing against the cool wood of the desk, anchoring herself amidst the rising tide of emotions. Throughout the lesson, Mr. Collins discussed upcoming assignments, explained the class structure, and introduced various instruments to be explored in the coming weeks. Yet, as he spoke, Emily could not help but notice how often his explanations seemed pointed, subtly implying that these tasks might prove too challenging for someone like her. His every word seemed crafted to cast doubt without ever saying it outright. When the class broke into small groups to familiarize themselves with different instruments, Emily remained seated, unsure where to begin. Students clustered naturally, chatting, laughing, experimenting with the array of instruments lining the walls. Emily's hands itched to touch them, to feel their shapes, to listen to the timbres only she could truly understand in her own way. Yet hesitation held her in place. Mr. Collins walked by slowly, stopping just behind her. "Is there a problem?" he asked without lowering his voice, drawing attention once again. "No, sir," Emily replied, struggling to keep her composure. "You're free to try any instrument you like," he said, the false politeness in his voice cutting like glass, "unless, of course, you need assistance." The word assistance dripped with condescension. Emily clenched her fists under the desk, cheeks burning. She wanted desperately to prove him wrong, to show him that she could belong here. But fear and uncertainty kept her anchored. As the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Mr. Collins added one last remark. "I expect everyone to be prepared tomorrow, no excuses." His gaze settled on Emily for a heartbeat longer than necessary before turning to shuffle his papers. Students filed out, some casting curious glances her way. A few whispered, though Emily couldn't make out their words. Olivia lingered, awkwardly attempting to offer Emily words of encouragement, but Emily merely nodded, needing space to process. Later, walking home with her mother, Emily replayed every word from that class. Her mother asked how it went, but Emily, not wanting to worry her, simply replied, "It was fine." Yet nothing about it felt fine. Inside, she struggled with feelings she knew too well: exclusion, judgment, and the overwhelming urge to prove herself. That night, lying awake, in the silence of her room, Emily could almost hear her father's voice again, gentle and steady. He would have told her that true music comes from the heart, not from anyone's approval. Clutching the ribbon in her hair, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would not give up. Not now, not ever. But she also knew that tomorrow's class would come with new challenges, and Mr. Collins had only just begun testing her resolve. The next day arrived cloaked in a tense silence that seemed to settle over Maplewood High School like a thick fog. Emily walked slowly through the school's main entrance, her cane lightly tapping the tiled floors, echoing against the long hallways. She could feel the weight of yesterday lingering on her shoulders, as if the eyes of her classmates still followed her every step. The memory of Mr. Collins's tone, sharp and dismissive, haunted her thoughts, but Emily forced herself to move forward. When she entered the music classroom, the usual chatter dimmed noticeably. Students whispered softly, but their glances were unmistakable. Emily's heart thudded against her chest as she found her seat. The air in the room felt different, heavy with anticipation, and something else she could not yet define. Mr. Collins stood by the grand piano, arms crossed, observing her arrival with a cold detachment. Without wasting a moment, Mr. Collins addressed the class. "Today," he began, his voice slicing through the murmur like a conductor's baton, "we will have a practical exercise." His deliberate pause hinted at something more. "Each of you will take turns demonstrating your familiarity with an instrument. Nothing too demanding, but enough for me to assess your potential." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Emily's stomach sank. She had barely entered the class, yet she already sensed that she was the intended target of whatever Mr. Collins had in mind. As students began stepping forward one by one, choosing familiar instruments, the atmosphere remained light, even jovial. Laughter and scattered applause accompanied each short performance. Then, without warning, Mr. Collins turned sharply toward Emily. "Miss Emily," he said, his tone falsely pleasant, "why don't you be next? Step forward, please." His words, though outwardly polite, carried an unmistakable edge. It was not a suggestion, it was a challenge. The room fell utterly silent. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. She hesitated for a second, heart racing, but then slowly stood, gripping her cane. Guided by the familiar rhythm of her steps, she made her way toward the front of the class. Mr. Collins's next words struck her like a slap. "Let us see," he said, turning toward the instrument shelves, "how you fare with the violin." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Gasps rippled quietly. Emily's pulse quickened. She had never touched a violin before. Piano, yes, it had been her world for as long as she could remember. But the violin, it was completely foreign. A student from the front row handed her the violin under Mr. Collins's command. The polished wood felt smooth and unfamiliar under her trembling fingers. The bow, slender and delicate, seemed impossibly light, yet intimidating. Emily could hear Mr. Collins's footsteps circling her like a predator, savoring the moment before, pouncing. "Well," he said, voice filled with expectation, "show us what you can do." His comment was followed by a murmur of uncomfortable shifting among the students. Even they sensed that this was less a lesson and more a spectacle. At Emily's expense, Emily inhaled deeply, steadying her shaking hands. She positioned the violin as best she could, trying to recall distant memories of orchestras and concerts her father once took her to, where violins sang beautifully. She had listened to them so many times, But listening was different from playing. She lifted the bow, aiming for the strings, unsure of the precise placement. The silence was suffocating. She could almost feel Mr. Collins's smirk without seeing it. The first sound that escaped was harsh and screechy, making a few students wince. Embarrassment surged like a wave, flushing her face. She adjusted, trembling, trying again. The second sound, though less jarring, was still far from melodic. The third attempt was softer, barely audible. "That will be enough," Mr. Collins said coldly, cutting through the fragile atmosphere. "Thank you." His dismissal was absolute, and for a second Emily stood frozen, her feet unwilling to move. Whispers returned like an unwelcome chorus, filling the room with quiet pity and awkward glances. As she returned to her seat, Emily's heart sank deeper. Olivia gave her a sympathetic look, but Emily could barely acknowledge it. Her cheeks burned with shame and her hands trembled against the smooth surface of her desk. She had been set up to fail, and worse, she had failed exactly as expected. Mr. Collins continued the class as if nothing had happened, moving on to the next student. The room, however, remained unsettled. Some students stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact, while others glanced sideways at Emily, unsure whether to feel sorry for her or relieved that they had not been in her position. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Emily was the first to leave. The hallway outside offered no refuge, echoing with the faint sounds of students discussing what had just transpired. Emily, head down, hurried away from the music room, each tap of her cane against the floor ringing louder than before. At home that evening, her mother noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Did something happen today?" she asked, softly, but Emily, holding back tears, could only muster, "No, nothing important." She retreated to her room, seeking the comfort of familiar silence. Sitting at the edge of her bed, she gripped the ribbon her father had given her, feeling its frayed edges between her fingers. The humiliation gnawed at her. The image of Mr. Collins standing there, satisfied with her discomfort, replayed endlessly in her mind. Yet beneath the shame, a tiny ember of defiance flickered quietly. She did not know how or when, but somewhere deep inside, Emily vowed that she would not let this be the end. There had to be a way to turn the very stage of her humiliation into something different, something no one would see coming, not even Mr. Collins. The sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of the music room the following day, projecting muted colors onto the polished floor. Emily entered, shoulders tense, aware that every step brought her closer to yet another encounter with Mr. Collins. The usual murmur of students preparing their instruments hushed subtly as she made her way to her seat. The memory of yesterday's humiliation remained raw, pulsing just beneath the surface of her thoughts. Emily sat quietly, fingers brushing against the edge of her desk, feeling the tiny imperfections in the wood. Though she tried to appear calm, the quickened rhythm of her heartbeat betrayed her unease. Mr. Collins, as punctual as ever, entered precisely when the clock marked the beginning of class. His shoes clicked rhythmically against the tiles as he crossed the room with the authority of someone who knew he commanded absolute control within these walls. "Settle down, everyone," he said, voice crisp. Then, after a calculated pause, his gaze, and though Emily could not see it, she could feel its sharpness, fell directly on her. "Miss Emily, please join me once again." The words echoed. In the silent room, each syllable deliberate. Emily's stomach twisted. She knew she could not refuse. Rising slowly, her cane tapping with soft defiance against the floor, she approached the front. The violin from yesterday rested on a stand, waiting like an accomplice. Mr. Collins gestured toward it. "Today," he continued with mock patience, "I would like you to try again. Surely even without sight one can improve overnight." Soft laughter rippled through the room. It was not cruel, but it was there. That awkward, uncertain amusement of teenagers unsure whether they should find this moment uncomfortable or entertaining. Emily's hands trembled as she picked up the violin, its polished surface smooth under her fingers, but foreign, unfamiliar, and unkind. She positioned the instrument carefully, heart pounding. The room felt too quiet, every ear tuned to her next move. Lifting the bow, Emily struggled to recall everything she had overheard from other students. everything she had once listened to in concerts and recordings. Yet the mechanics of playing were still elusive. The first note was uneven, brittle. The second scratched weakly against the strings. Her grip faltered slightly, making the third note nearly mute. Mr. Collins remained motionless, arms crossed, a cold observer watching the unraveling. Students shifted in their chairs, some biting, their lips in discomfort, others exchanging hesitant glances. Even Olivia, seated near the front, seemed torn between wanting to intervene and knowing it would only make things worse. Emily tried once more, adjusting the bow's angle and pressing the strings with more determination, but lacking the tactile, familiarity and muscle memory that came only with time and guidance. The sound that emerged was jagged, fragmented. She knew it wasn't music. It was a cacophony of effort and desperation. "Enough," Mr. Collins said, voice cutting through the air like a blade. He did not raise his voice, but the word carried finality. "Thank you, Emily." For a moment, Emily stood there, frozen, bow still resting on the strings. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly, she lowered the violin and returned it to the stand. The walk back to her seat felt like miles. With each cautious step, she could feel eyes following her, not with mockery, but with a complex mix of sympathy, discomfort, and curiosity. She did not want their pity. She wanted dignity. Mr. Collins resumed the lesson without further acknowledgement of the scene. He moved on to discuss the fundamentals of harmony and ensemble playing, his words washing over Emily without meaning. She could barely hear him. All she could focus on was the dull ache in her chest and the burning sensation behind her eyes, as she fought to remain composed. When the bell finally dismissed them, Olivia approached hesitantly. "Emily, if you want, I can help you practice after school," she offered quietly. The sincerity in her voice broke through the fog of Emily's humiliation. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, but said nothing. The words simply refused to come. Outside, as students scattered through the halls, fragments of whispered conversations reached her ears. "I felt bad for her," one voice said. "Why did he make her do that?" asked another. Yet none of it eased the sting. It wasn't there. Sympathy she wanted. It was respect. And respect she knew could not be begged for. It had to be earned or taken. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table, Emily barely touched her dinner. Her mother noticed but respected her silence. Later in her room, Emily let the tears come, not because she wanted to, but because holding them back felt impossible. She pressed her father's ribbon to her cheek, remembering the nights he used to hum melodies to her when she was little, promising her that music was something felt more than seen. As the room darkened around her, Emily whispered to herself the same words she used to hear him say, "Music lives inside you." And for the first time since arriving in Maplewood, Emily realized that no matter how heavy the humiliation, it would not define her. But how she responded to it, that could. She knew she was not ready yet, but the seed had been planted. Somewhere within her, the determination to turn this failure into something greater had quietly begun to grow. And though Mr. Collins might have dismissed her today, Emily promised herself silently that the next time she stood in front of that class, things would be different. The days that followed passed slowly, each class dragging longer than the last. The tension Emily carried after the public embarrassment refused to fade. Even walking through the halls felt heavier, as if every glance she sensed carried the memory of her struggle in front of the entire music class. Yet despite the lingering sting of humiliation, Emily returned each day to her seat near the back of the room, determined not to cower. She refused to give Mr. Collins the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. The weather turned colder as autumn deepened its grip on Maplewood. Leaves crunched underfoot as Emily crossed the courtyard on her way to the music room, bracing herself for another uneasy session. Inside, Mr. Collins was already speaking when she arrived, his deep voice listing the objectives for the day's lesson with detached precision. Halfway through the class, Mr. Collins, perhaps sensing that the students' attention was waning, clapped his hands sharply. "Let us do something practical," he announced. His gaze, as calculated as ever, found Emily again. "Emily, Since you've had some time to recover from our little trial, why don't you try again? This time let us see if fortune favors you." The room fell into that familiar hush, but this time Emily stood without hesitation. The pit in her stomach remained, but something had shifted. She stepped forward, her cane tapping softly until she reached the front where the violin waited. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the instrument, but this time it wasn't fear alone, it was determination trying to steady her. She placed the violin beneath her chin, adjusted the bow, and took a breath. The moment the bow touched the string, something unexpected happened. The note that sang out was not perfect, but it was clear, full, and steady. The students straightened in their seats. Olivia blinked, leaning forward unconsciously. Emily surprised herself, adjusted slightly, and let the next note come. Then, another. She did not know the fingerings, but she knew music. She had listened to countless violinists, felt their phrasing and timing deep within her bones. Her ear, trained for years to catch the most delicate nuances, guided her fingers instinctively. The room was still. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, only the pure sound of the violin filling the space. Though simple, the melody Emily found herself playing was unmistakably beautiful. It was hesitant, fragile like a bird taking flight for the first time, but it was music, real music. When she finished, Emily's breath caught. She hadn't meant to play a full melody, but her instincts had carried her through it. She lowered the violin slowly, heart pounding. For a heartbeat, the room was completely silent. A soft gasp broke the stillness, followed by scattered whispers. Olivia's eyes shone with astonishment. Even a few students who had previously kept their distance now exchanged surprised glances. Yet, when Emily dared to look toward the sound of Mr. Collins's footsteps, she could tell from the stiffness in his stride that he was not pleased. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and gave the most dismissive nod possible. "Lucky," he said curtly. "You stumbled upon a few decent notes. Do not mistake that for skill." His words, though sharp, sounded forced, like someone who had just witnessed something they could not easily explain. Emily returned to her seat, unsure of what had just happened. She could still feel the vibration of the strings in her fingers, the resonance of the notes lingering in her chest. The other students avoided staring directly, but murmured quietly amongst themselves, for their curiosity unmistakable. After class, Olivia caught up to her. "Emily, that was incredible. How did you even do that?" Her voice was a mix of awe and genuine admiration. Emily shrugged, still processing it herself. I just listened. I remembered how it sounds when real violinists play." Olivia smiled, stepping closer. "You have to keep going. If you want, I'll help you. I don't know much about teaching, but I can read you the sheet music and describe the positions." Emily hesitated, but then nodded. The fear she carried these past days did not vanish, but it was softened by Olivia's words. For the first time since arriving in Maplewood, someone saw her not as the blind girl who failed, but as a musician. And for Emily, that small spark of recognition meant everything. That evening, sitting at home with the violin she had borrowed under Olivia's suggestion, Emily touched its strings gently, letting her fingers get used to its delicate curves. Her mother watched from the doorway, cautious but supportive. Emily did not explain what had happened in class, but her mother could sense that something had shifted. As night deepened and Emily lay awake, the memory of the melody returned, clearer now. She realized that perhaps Mr. Collins was wrong. It had not been luck. It was her ears, her memory, and the music she carried inside. She had found a way to make it speak, even if imperfectly. Emily understood that the path ahead would not be easy. Mr. Collins was likely to become even harsher. The students might still doubt her, and every note would require more effort than most could imagine. But now Emily had something she lacked before, proof, however small, that she could. Not because of luck, but because music, even from an unfamiliar instrument, lived within her. And if music lived within her, then she would find a way to let the world hear it. The following week unfolded with an almost unbearable quietness. Students whispered less about Emily, but the memory of her fragile yet striking performance remained in the air like an unspoken question. Mr. Collins, however, resumed his rigid teaching methods without acknowledging what had occurred. His cold demeanor did not waver, yet Emily could feel that behind his usual sharp remarks there was a trace of irritation. He had seen something he could not easily dismiss, and that unsettled him. Emily, however, found herself changed. The faint applause, the surprise in Olivia's voice, and the power she had felt in those fleeting notes were enough to prevent her from sinking back into despair. Yet, it was also clear that she could not advance alone. She needed guidance, someone who could bridge the gap between her sharp musical instincts and the technical demands of the violin. On a cloudy Wednesday afternoon, while Emily was quietly arranging her sheet music in the corner of the school library, she heard a voice she had only vaguely recognized from class. "Hey, Emily?" It was Josh, a tall, soft-spoken student with a reputation for being kind but distant. She turned her head instinctively toward the sound of his voice. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "I saw you the other day in music class. That was impressive." His voice carried no hint of pity, only curiosity and genuine respect. Emily stiffened slightly, unsure if she should trust his words, but Josh continued, "I actually play the violin too, but I'm not exactly first chair material. Still, I think I could help, if you want." Emily hesitated. Offers of help often came laced with charity or subtle condescension. Yet there was something different in Josh's voice. He spoke not to a helpless girl, but to a fellow musician. She could hear it. You don't think it was just luck?" Emily asked, half challenging, half hopeful. Josh chuckled softly. "No. Luck doesn't make someone find phrasing like that without ever touching the instrument before. That was real." The words landed heavier than he could have imagined. For Emily, they were not just kind, they were validation. "I don't know how to read sheet music," she confessed. "I only know how it sounds. I memorize it. I hear it." Josh's response was immediate. "That's amazing, actually. A lot of people train for years and still don't listen properly. You already have the hardest part." From that moment, an unlikely partnership began. Every afternoon after school, Josh and Emily met quietly in the music room whenever it was empty, or sometimes in the old echoing auditorium that most students avoided due to its creaky floors and drafty windows. Olivia occasionally joined, but mostly it was just the two of them, sharing a language that required no sight, only sound and patience. Josh would describe every technical detail carefully. "Your first finger should go here," he would say, guiding Emily's hand gently. "Now listen to how it sounds. That's the A." Slowly, Emily absorbed every instruction, translating each tactile and auditory cue into muscle memory. At first, the progress was painstaking. Emily grew, frustrated when her fingers slipped or when the bow scratched instead of singing. But every time doubt crept in, Josh was there to remind her, "You hear it better than anyone. Let your ears lead." Over the weeks, the sessions became less about learning specific notes and more about Emily learning to trust herself. She discovered that by focusing on the resonance, the vibration beneath her fingertips, and the subtle tension of the strings, she could find the correct pitches without ever needing to see them. Their friendship deepened beyond music. During breaks, Josh shared stories of growing up in Maplewood, of how he originally picked up the violin because of his grandmother. Emily, in turn, spoke softly of her father and the loss that had shaped much of her world. Josh never asked intrusive questions, never pushed. He simply listened. One afternoon, as they sat on the auditorium stage after a particularly successful practice, Josh turned to her. "You know, Emily, Mr. Collins might think you don't belong in that class. But he's wrong. You're probably the best musician in there. You just haven't fully realized it yet." Emily did not reply immediately. She let the words linger, soaking in their weight. No one had ever told her that before, not even her father. He had always said she was talented, but hearing it from someone who had watched her struggle and persevere meant something different. At home, Emily's mother noticed the subtle change. Emily practiced more, often humming softly while preparing dinner or setting the table. The violin never left her side, its presence now as familiar as her cane. The music that once was confined to her memories began filling their small home, wrapping itself around every corner, every worn piece of furniture, and every echoing silence. Yet despite the progress, Emily knew that the challenges were far from over. Mr. Collins's silence in class was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. He rarely called on her anymore, but Emily could sense his scrutiny. He watched from afar, as if waiting for a reason to reinforce his doubts. Still, Emily pressed on. Each day with Josh brought her closer to controlling the violin, to making it more than just an instrument, to making it an extension of herself. And though she feared the inevitable confrontation with Mr. Collins, part of her for the first time felt ready. Music was no longer just a refuge, it was becoming her voice. And with Josh's help, Emily was beginning to learn how to make it heard, no matter who tried to silence it. As the weeks quietly unfolded, Emily and Josh's secret training sessions became the heartbeat of her daily life. Each school day passed with the monotony of lessons and lingering stares, but Emily no longer drifted helplessly through the hallways. There was a quiet determination in her steps, a subtle but undeniable shift that had not gone unnoticed by Olivia and a few others. Still, Emily and Josh guarded their sessions like a fragile secret. They knew well that Mr. Collins would disapprove, perhaps even forbid it outright, and neither was willing to risk losing this hidden world they had created. Every afternoon, as the school emptied and the sun began to cast golden beams through the tall windows, Emily would wait for Josh by the old auditorium. The space was imperfect. Cold drafts swept through the cracked walls, and the stage creaked under every step. But to them, it was a sanctuary. Dust particles floated lazily in the streams of light, and the faded curtains whispered softly with each breeze. The imperfection of the place only heightened the intimacy of the music that slowly began to fill its empty seats. Josh would read sheet music aloud, carefully articulating every interval, bowing instruction and dynamic marking. Emily, in turn, translated his descriptions into delicate, precise movements. Progress came not in sudden bursts, but in a slow, steady climb, each mistake refining her technique rather than discouraging her. The violin, once a mysterious and uncooperative object in her hands, began to respond with increasing grace. Josh marveled at her ability to memorize entire passages after hearing them just once. "You have the ear of someone who has been doing this for years," he often told her, and Emily started to believe it. She could now feel when a note resonated correctly, sensing the vibration that coursed through the strings and into her fingertips. It was as if the instrument itself was speaking to her. Their sessions were not confined solely to technique. Often, they would lose themselves discussing the emotional weight behind each piece. Josh would describe the imagery and stories often associated with certain compositions, while Emily, eyes closed, would listen intently and then attempt to recreate those emotions purely through sound. She learned that music, more than anything, was storytelling, and she had stories to tell. One evening, after a particularly moving session where Emily flawlessly played a short, melancholic waltz, Josh remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, there was a quiet reverence in his voice. "Emily, you're not just getting better, you're becoming something special." Emily sat motionless, holding the violin gently on her lap. The compliment felt too large to fully grasp. "You really think so?" she asked. Josh nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I know so." The following days saw Emily's confidence grow. Though she still remained silent in class, she now listened to Mr. Collins's lectures with a different perspective. She could hear the underlying structure of the lessons, connect them to what Josh had taught her, and internalize them without the need for Mr. Collins's approval. Emily realized that she no longer needed to prove herself to him directly. She was learning, progressing, and soon she would have her chance to speak through music alone. Yet despite their discretion, the risk of discovery always loomed. The school janitor once stumbled upon them during an afternoon session, giving them a suspicious look but saying nothing. Another time, Olivia narrowly missed catching them as she searched for a forgotten textbook. Each close call reminded them that what they were doing might not be technically forbidden, but in Mr. Collins's eyes, it would certainly be considered unacceptable. At home, Emily's mother remained unaware of the secret rehearsals. However, she noticed her daughter's increasing attachment to the violin, the hours spent running her fingers along the fingerboard, even without playing, and the quiet hum of melodies filling the small living room each evening. "You seem brighter lately," her mother commented one night. Emily only smiled faintly, unwilling to share too much just yet. This was hers. Winter approached, and with it, the school's annual talent showcase. Flyers were plastered across every bulletin board, inviting students to participate. Emily had known of its existence, but when Olivia handed her one during lunch, the reality struck her differently. "You should sign up," Olivia said almost shyly. "You don't have to, of course, but I think people would love to hear you play properly." The idea terrified Emily. It was one thing to practice in secret, where mistakes could be part of the learning. It was another entirely to perform before the entire school, under the unflinching gaze of Mr. Collins. Yet, as she fingered the edges of the flyer, her mind raced with images of her father smiling at her first piano recital, of the warmth she felt when Josh first called her a real musician. That evening during rehearsal, Emily mentioned the showcase to Josh. He paused, bow in hand, considering. "I think you should do it," he said simply. "Not for Mr. Collins, not for anyone else. For you. To show yourself that you're not just surviving here, you're making music." The words stayed with her long after she returned home. Sitting on her bed, she ran her fingers over her father's ribbon, tying it gently to the scroll of her violin. She did not yet know what she would play, how she would stand on that stage without trembling, or how Mr. Collins would react. But, for the first time since arriving in Maplewood, Emily felt the smallest flicker of excitement breaking through the fear. As the cold deepened and snow began to blanket the streets outside, Emily knew that something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer merely enduring. She was preparing, and soon she would be ready to let them hear what they all failed to see, ready to speak through the only voice that had never failed her, music itself. It was on a grey, windswept afternoon that the fragile balance Emily and Josh had so carefully maintained unraveled. The school, emptied after the final bell, stood eerily quiet, except for the occasional echo of footsteps in distant hallways. Emily and Josh, engrossed in refining a particularly delicate passage from a sonata, had not noticed the faint creak of the auditorium's side door, nor the familiar cadence of measured footsteps approaching the stage. Mr. Collins's voice, sharp and unmistakable, shattered the intimate atmosphere. "What exactly do you two think you are doing?" His words reverberated through the vast empty space, sending a chill through both students. Emily froze, bow suspended mid-air, heart pounding violently against her ribs. Josh turned quickly, eyes wide, but said nothing. Mr. Collins stood rigid, at the foot of the stage, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but for the steel hardness in his gaze. "We were practicing," Josh began cautiously, stepping slightly in front of Emily as if to shield her from the inevitable storm. "It's not against any rules." Mr. Collins's eyes narrowed. "Practicing? Without supervision, without permission, and without proper instruction?" His voice rose subtly with each accusation. "Miss Emily," he continued, shifting, his attention squarely onto her, "did you think sneaking around the school defying classroom structure would somehow compensate for your limitations?" The word stung more than any insult before. Emily stood still, gripping the violin, as though it might somehow anchor her. "I just wanted to learn," she replied quietly but firmly. "I wasn't hurting anyone." Mr. Collins's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Hurting? No. Wasting time? Absolutely." He ascended the stage with slow, deliberate steps towering over them both. "This room is not your private playground. I will not tolerate unsanctioned use of school property." Emily's voice faltered. "But no," Mr. Collins interrupted coldly. "As of today, you are forbidden from using the auditorium and the music room outside scheduled class hours. Any further misuse will result in formal disciplinary action." His words were final, his authority unquestioned in the emptiness of the auditorium. Josh's fists clenched at his sides. "That's not fair." Mr. Collins turned his glare on him. "Life is rarely fair, Mr. Walker. Get used to it." The silence that followed was unbearable. Mr. Collins swept from the stage, leaving the dock swinging behind him. Emily stood motionless, the violin still in her grasp, now feeling heavier than ever. Josh exhaled sharply, frustration etched into every line of his face. Emily's world crumbled quietly. The sanctuary they had built, the fragile confidence she was beginning to trust, had been shattered with a single decree. The walk home was silent. Even Josh's attempts at reassurance fell flat against the weight of the injustice. At home, Emily said nothing to her mother, merely claiming exhaustion. Yet when night settled, tears streamed down her face silently, soaking the pillow beneath her. The violin rested against the wall untouched for the first time in weeks. Mr. Collins's words echoed relentlessly: limitations, wasting time, disobedience. Emily replayed the confrontation repeatedly, questioning every choice she had made. The following day at school felt colder, sharper. Though Mr. Collins made no further public remarks, the message was clear. Emily was no longer welcome to explore music on her own terms. Her classmates sensed the shift. Olivia approached hesitantly during lunch, offering quiet words of comfort, but Emily could only manage a faint nod. Even Josh seemed subdued. "I'm sorry," he whispered after class. "I should have seen it coming." Emily shook her head. "It's not your fault." Yet privately, Emily struggled. The violin, once a symbol of her quiet rebellion, now sat in the corner of her room like a relic of a dream that might not survive. Still, as the week dragged on, something stubborn sparked within her. The anger, the injustice, the overwhelming unfairness of it all. It did not snuff out her resolve. It fed it. Late at night, when the house was silent except for the wind, scratching against the windows, Emily sat in the living room with the violin pressed against her shoulder. She drew the bow gently across the strings. The sound was faint, but sure. She closed her eyes and played quietly, not for anyone else, not for performance or approval, but simply to remind herself that Mr. Collins could take away a room, but not the music itself. Her father's words returned to her, not as a distant memory, but as a living truth. Music does not live in buildings, it lives in you. Emily realized that Mr. Collins's punishment, harsh as it was, could only reach so far. He could lock doors and make rules, but he could not touch what mattered most. And if Emily had learned anything from the past weeks, it was that music had never been about permission. With renewed determination, she began to think differently. If not the auditorium, then where? If not with Mr. Collins's approval, then without it. As the night deepened and the stars blinked faintly through her window, Emily understood something that neither Mr. Collins nor anyone else could ever take from her. The music was hers. Always had been, always would be. Emily awoke the next morning with a silent resolve. Though the cold air of December seeped through the thin walls of their small home, she moved with deliberate calm, as if something inside her had hardened overnight. Mr. Collins's prohibition echoed in her mind, but so did the gentle, unwavering notes she had played the night before, alone in the quiet living room. There was no turning back. She would not be silenced. At school, the bulletin board announcing the annual talent showcase stood like a challenge at the entrance to the main hallway. Students gathered around it, debating who would participate, who would simply watch, and who would dare to stand on that stage. Emily approached it slowly, guided by the sound of voices and the familiar rhythm of footsteps. When her fingers found the sign-up sheet tacked below the flyer, she traced the names carefully. The list was still short, but that did not matter. Without hesitation, she picked up the pen and signed her name. A few students noticed, pausing mid-conversation. Whispers followed immediately. "Did she really just sign up?" one voice asked. "With the violin?" another added. Emily ignored them all, letting the noise pass over her. She turned away and continued down the hall as if the chatter meant nothing. And for the first time, it almost didn't. Word spread quickly. By the time Emily reached the music classroom for her regular lesson, even Olivia's voice carried a note of surprise. "You signed up," she said quietly, joining Emily at her usual seat. Emily nodded. "I did." Mr. Collins, who had been arranging sheet music at his desk, looked up sharply. His eyes, hidden behind the usual coldness of his expression, flashed, briefly with something close to disbelief. Yet he said nothing. He merely resumed his work, leaving the silence to speak for him. Later that day, Emily met Josh by the old auditorium as usual. His expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, scanning her face carefully. "I am," Emily replied without hesitation. "I don't care about Mr. Collins or anyone else. I need to do this." Josh smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure you're ready." Since the auditorium and music room were now off-limits, they improvised. Emily and Josh found refuge in unexpected places. They practiced in the town's small abandoned greenhouse behind the science building, where broken panes let in the cold wind, but also created a soft, natural echo. On weekends, they took to the park, where Emily's notes mingled with the rustling of dry leaves and the distant laughter of children. Each session became more than just practice. Emily learned to adapt not only to the instrument, but to every environment. The uneven sounds of the park, the distant hum of traffic, the whispering wind through the greenhouse, all became part of her training. Josh continued to guide her patiently, describing finger positions, bowing techniques, and phrasing. Emily, for her part, focused relentlessly, building not just skill but an emotional connection to every piece she played. The winter deepened, and with it Emily's resolve. She selected a piece for the talent show, a composition she remembered vividly from her father's collection. It was a simple but profound arrangement that spoke of loss, hope, and quiet. Resilience. She spent nights memorizing its structure, crafting each phrase until it felt as natural as breathing. Yet the anxiety never fully left her. There were nights when doubts overwhelmed her, when the weight of performing in front of the entire school, including Mr. Collins, threatened to suffocate her courage. Josh remained her constant anchor. "Remember," he would say, "you're not doing this to impress anyone. You're telling a story. Your story." One evening, as they sat among the remnants of wilted plants in the greenhouse, Josh asked, "Why this piece?" Emily traced the ribbon tied delicately around her violin's scroll. "My father used to play it for me," she said softly. "It was the last thing I remember him playing before we lost him." Josh nodded, saying nothing more, understanding that no further words were needed. Days turned into weeks. The showcase crept closer, and Emily's playing grew stronger, more confident. The small circle of students who had initially whispered about her began to watch her with new curiosity. Olivia, always discreet, offered her support quietly but firmly. "You're going to surprise them," she whispered one afternoon as Emily passed in the hallway. Emily did not know if Olivia meant Mr. Collins, the students, or herself, perhaps all of them. By the time the night of the showcase arrived, snow blanketed Maplewood, transforming the town into a silent, frozen landscape. The auditorium glowed softly from the inside, filled with students, parents, and teachers bundled in coats and scarves. Emily stood backstage, violin in hand, trying to calm the storm within her. She could hear the audience settling in, the shuffling of programs, the occasional cough, and above all, the murmur of anticipation. Somewhere beyond the stage, she knew Mr. Collins would be watching. But this time the thought did not paralyze her. Standing beside Josh, who had come backstage for one final word of encouragement, Emily took a deep breath. "You can still back out," Josh teased gently, knowing full well she would not. Emily gripped the violin tighter. Not this time. And as her name was called, and the soft glow of the stage lights beckoned her forward, Emily stepped out. Not as the girl who had stumbled under pressure, nor as the blind student who others whispered about, but as a musician ready to share the story she had carried alone for too long. And though fear still lingered quietly in her chest, it was no longer in control. Emily had made her decision. There would be no retreat, only music. The evening air inside the Maplewood High School auditorium was thick with anticipation. The murmurs of students, parents, and teachers filled the space as friends and families huddled together on the worn velvet seats, brushing snowflakes from their coats. The annual talent showcase had always been one of the few events that brought the entire town together, and tonight was no exception. The large red curtain swayed gently, as if aware of the hidden stories about to unfold behind it. Backstage, Emily stood in silence, gripping her violin as tightly as she dared without damaging it. The polished wood, now familiar and warm under her fingertips, felt like the only constant in a night swarming with uncertainty. Around her, performers fidgeted nervously, adjusting costumes, tuning instruments, whispering last-minute encouragements. Yet Emily stood still, distant from the bustling energy, listening to every sound and letting it map the room in her mind. When the announcer's voice called her name, a ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Whispers spread instantly. Some students widened their eyes, others leaned forward in disbelief. "She's really going to play," someone murmured. Mr. Collins, seated stiffly in the front row among the faculty, adjusted his glasses slowly, a skeptical frown shadowing his features. Emily took a step forward, cane tapping softly, and was gently guided by Olivia, who had volunteered to assist discreetly without drawing attention. As they reached center stage, Olivia handed her the violin and quietly slipped away, leaving Emily standing alone under the stage lights. The brightness was blinding even to someone who could not see, the heat of the lamps bearing down like the gaze of hundreds. But Emily closed her eyes, tuning it all out until the only sounds that remained were the hush of the audience and the faint hum of the old heating system struggling against the winter chill. Taking a deep breath, Emily positioned the violin beneath her chin. Her fingers instinctively found their marks. The bow, light as a feather, rested against the strings, waiting. For one brief, agonizing moment, fear clawed at her throat. Every memory of failure, every word of doubt from Mr. Collins, and every self-imposed question rose all at once. But then, like a whispered reminder, came the echo of her father's voice in her mind. Music is not something you see, it's something you feel. Emily exhaled slowly and began to play. The first notes were gentle, trembling slightly like the first snowfall of the season. But as she continued, the sound deepened, gaining texture and warmth. Each phrase flowed naturally, as if the story within the music had always been waiting to be told. The melody, simple yet filled with complex emotion, resonated through the auditorium. It carried the sorrow of loss, the quiet strength of resilience, and the fragile beauty of hope. Emily played not for perfection, but for truth. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. The vibrations from the violin reached beyond, her fingertips into the air, into the hearts of those watching. The room, once filled with whispers and doubtful glances, now sat frozen. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even a whisper disturbed the performance. Some students who had only ever seen Emily through the narrow lens of pity or curiosity now found themselves captivated, eyes fixed, hearts unexpectedly moved. From his seat, Mr. Collins remained rigid. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the surprise and disbelief he could no longer conceal. This was not luck. This was not a fluke. It was undeniable talent. The expression that flickered across his face was neither anger nor satisfaction, but a rare vulnerability, the look of a man forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. Emily continued, allowing herself to be guided solely by the music. Every shift in harmony, every swelling crescendo, every soft decrescendo was crafted not from sight but from memory and feeling. She poured into the performance every ounce of loneliness, every moment of fear, and every small triumph she had experienced since arriving in Maplewood. When the final note lingered and slowly faded into silence, Emily remained motionless for a heartbeat, letting the resonance dissipate into the quiet. The audience remained silent, stunned, and then, like a slow-rising wave, the applause erupted. Students, parents, teachers, all stood, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. The room filled with the sound of cheers, the rustling of people rising to their feet, and the uncontrollable swell of admiration. Emily stood there, overwhelmed but grounded, bow still in hand, absorbing the sound not just as noise, but as recognition. For the first time, she was not the blind girl struggling to fit in. She was the musician who had made them feel something real. Backstage, Olivia and Josh exchanged glances, filled with pride and astonishment. Olivia whispered, "She did it," while Josh could only nod, eyes glistening with unshed tears. In the front row, Mr. Collins remained seated for a long second, before slowly standing with the others. His clapping was stiff, mechanical even, but his eyes betrayed something no student had ever seen before: doubt. For a man so convinced of his judgments, the certainty had been stripped away. Emily bowed gracefully, and as she turned to leave the stage, felt the ribbon tied to her violin's scroll brush against her cheek. She smiled softly, knowing that somewhere her father would have been clapping too. As the curtain closed behind her, Emily did not feel the weight of expectation or fear anymore. She had told her story. The next chapter, whatever it might be, would begin not with shame or hesitation, but with the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who had already faced her greatest fear and transformed it into music. The echoes of applause still reverberated through the walls of the auditorium, long after Emily left the stage. Backstage, the chaos was immediate. Students congratulated her without restraint, some in hushed amazement, others with genuine enthusiasm. Olivia hugged her tightly without asking for permission, while Josh stood beside them, visibly overwhelmed. The quiet respect Emily had earned through whispers and cautious glances was suddenly replaced by open admiration. For once, there were no sideways looks, no hesitant stares, only recognition. As Emily carefully set her violin down on a nearby chair, she let herself breathe, feeling the release of a tension she had carried for far too long. Every tremor in her fingers, every mistake she had feared on that stage had vanished into the music itself. In that moment, Emily realized she had not just performed, she had spoken, and they had listened. Meanwhile, inside the auditorium, the audience still buzzed with conversation. Parents whispered to one another, visibly affected. Students who had come expecting an awkward display now debated excitedly about how flawlessly Emily had played. Even teachers who had barely noticed her existence throughout the semester now exchanged puzzled glances, questioning silently how they could have missed such talent. At the front, Mr. Collins remained seated, fingers tightly clasped. The storm, raging inside him, was invisible to most, but those who paid attention could see the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture. He stared at the stage's closed curtain as if searching for an explanation. He could find none. He had expected, no, planned, for her to falter. Yet, instead of failure, he had witnessed something undeniable. For Mr. Collins, it was more than discomfort. It was a direct confrontation with his own prejudices. He had built his career on order, structure, and the belief that skill could only emerge through strict methods. Emily's success, raw and honest, challenged the very foundation of his teaching. Yet even amidst his internal turmoil, the teacher in him could not deny the truth. What he had heard tonight was beyond anything he had prepared his students for. When Emily returned briefly to the wings to watch the remainder of the showcase, she did so quietly. She sat beside Josh and Olivia, who whispered excited remarks about her performance, but Emily listened more to the subtle reactions of the audience. She heard them speaking about her, not with pity, but with genuine admiration. As the event concluded, and students gathered for final acknowledgements, Principal Dawson took the stage to congratulate all participants. His voice, usually monotone and perfunctory during school events, carried an unmistakable warmth. "Tonight," he said, "we witnessed many talented performances, but I must commend Emily Parker for reminding us that music, like all true art, transcends limitations." The auditorium erupted once again in applause. Emily remained where she was, her cheeks warming slightly. She had not sought attention, only the chance to share her music. Yet now standing ovations and praise surrounded her. Mr. Collins, still in his seat, finally rose slowly and made his way toward the backstage area. Olivia was the first to notice him approaching. She nudged Emily gently. "He's coming," she whispered, uncertainty in her voice. Emily turned toward the sound of his footsteps, standing tall despite the slight tremble that threatened to return. Mr. Collins stopped just short of her, clearing his throat. His silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds. Finally, he spoke, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "Miss Parker." He hesitated, words clearly weighing heavily on him. "That was unexpected." Emily said nothing, unsure of whether to brace for another condescending remark or a reluctant compliment. Mr. Collins continued, eyes cast slightly downward. "You played well, exceptionally well." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I misjudged you." Josh and Olivia exchanged wide-eyed glances, but Emily remained composed. "Thank you, sir," she replied simply, resisting the urge to say more. There was no need. The performance had already spoken for her. Mr. Collins gave a stiff nod and turned, disappearing into the departing crowd. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself at the center of a stream of congratulations. Students who had previously kept their distance approached her, sharing kind words and asking about her training. Parents of classmates offered genuine compliments. Even teachers who had never directly addressed her now offered approving nods. At home later that night, as the snow continued to fall softly outside, Emily sat alone with her violin. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the wind brushing against the windows. She ran her fingers along the violin's strings without playing, feeling their familiar texture. Her mother entered quietly, having heard from several parents who called to express how moved they had been. She knelt beside Emily, embracing her tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "So proud." Emily, exhausted but fulfilled, allowed herself to rest against her mother's shoulder. In that stillness, she realized she no longer feared Mr. Collins, the school, or even the expectations of others. She had found her voice, and no obstacle, however cruel or unexpected, could take that away. The performance was over, but something much more profound had just begun. Emily was no longer just the blind girl struggling to fit in. She was Emily Parker, the violinist, who against every odd had forced them all to listen. And they did. Not out of obligation or pity, but out of genuine admiration. And for the first time she knew deep down that the music inside her would never again be silenced. The days following the showcase unfolded like a surreal dream. The usual chatter in the hallways shifted noticeably. Where Emily once moved through crowds as an unnoticed presence, or worse, the subject of quiet pity, now she was met with nods, greetings, and even small clusters of students who paused their conversations to acknowledge her. The music she had played that night had left a mark deeper than she anticipated. It was not merely admiration, it was respect. Even the teachers seemed altered. Mr. Collins, who resumed his classes with his trademark rigid posture, could no longer feign indifference. His lectures, once laced with subtle dismissals when addressing Emily, were now marked by a careful neutrality. He rarely called upon her directly, but when he did, there was no longer a sharpness to his words. In fact, there was something far more profound, a silence that suggested reflection. Emily noticed it instantly. He avoided eye contact more often now, and while he never openly addressed the performance, the absence of his former condescension spoke volumes. What surprised Emily the most was the subtle change in her classmates. Olivia remained a loyal friend, standing by her side with quiet pride. Josh, of course, was steadfast, still helping during practice sessions and sitting beside her in the cafeteria, as they always had. But it was the others, the ones who had been distant, indifferent, or even silently judgmental, who now seemed to look at her differently. Some approached cautiously. "That was amazing," one student said during lunch. Others asked, with genuine curiosity, how long she had been playing or if she intended to perform again. Even those who didn't speak directly now treated her as a peer, not as a curiosity. Emily handled it with quiet grace. She did not seek out attention, nor did she let herself be swept away by it. She continued her practice, sometimes with Josh, sometimes alone at home, always careful to remember why she had begun this journey. The goal had never been applause. It had always been about reclaiming her voice, the one she thought she had lost when her father died. The school administration, sensing the waves her performance had caused, officially invited her to represent Maplewood High School in the upcoming state music contest. Principal Dawson personally called her and her mother to the office to deliver the news. Emily sat quietly as he praised her talent, noting how proud the school was to have her as their representative. Her mother, sitting beside her, could barely hold back tears. Josh and Olivia celebrated the news as soon as Emily told them. "You'll be great," Josh assured her, "and this time you'll show not just the school, but the entire state." Olivia agreed enthusiastically. "Everyone will finally understand what we already know." Yet, as much as the recognition warmed her, Emily remained cautious. She knew that success could just as easily draw new challenges. The state contest would not be like the school's showcase. There would be competitors who had trained since childhood, instructors far more supportive than Mr. Collins had ever been, and judges who wouldn't care about her story, only her music. Mr. Collins' reaction to the news was perhaps the most peculiar. After class one afternoon, when most students had left, he called to Emily. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice devoid of its usual sharpness, "I heard you will be representing the school." Emily turned toward him, waiting. He adjusted, his glasses clearly uncomfortable. "It is a fitting choice." He paused, struggling, then added with deliberate care, "You did well." The room seemed to hold its breath. It was the closest thing to an apology Emily suspected she would ever receive from him. And yet she nodded, accepting it, not for his sake, but for her own. She did not need his validation anymore, but acknowledging his effort to change, however small, felt right. At home, preparations for the contest began quietly. Emily's mother, though unsure of how to help musically, became her constant emotional support, ensuring that Emily had the space and encouragement to focus entirely on the task ahead. They would often sit together in the evenings, sipping tea as Emily practiced softly. In these moments, Emily realized that she was not just preparing for a contest. She was honoring everything she had carried silently, her grief, her love for her father, and the journey that had brought her to this point. Josh continued to help as always, bringing new pieces to challenge her, refining what they had already mastered, and keeping her spirits grounded. Yet, despite the growing recognition, Emily never lost sight of what mattered most. It wasn't about trophies or applause. It wasn't about proving Mr. Collins wrong or impressing the judges. It was about telling her story through the music. The story of a girl who had been silenced by fear and grief, but who found a way to make the world listen, not through sight, but through sound. With each passing day, as the contest drew nearer, Emily felt less like the shy girl who first arrived in Maplewood, and more like the musician she was always meant to be. And though nerves fluttered inside her chest, they were softened by a quiet confidence, a knowing that no matter what happened next, she had already won the most important battle of all. She had found her voice, and now nothing and no one could take it from her. The day of the state music contest arrived, cloaked in the soft silence of a snow-covered morning. Maplewood streets, usually bustling even during winter, seemed quieter than usual as Emily and her mother made their way to the city where the event was held. The drive was long and punctuated by brief exchanges, but most of the time was spent in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Emily's fingers traced the familiar ribbon tied to her violin case, grounding herself. Upon arriving at the grand auditorium, Emily could hear the distant hum of dozens of musicians preparing. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh programs, the scent of formality and anticipation. She felt the vibrations of hurried footsteps on the marble floors, the rustling of sheet music, and the occasional sharp note escaping from warming up instruments. Josh and Olivia, who had traveled separately with a small group of supportive students, found Emily in the backstage area. Their presence immediately soothed her. "You've got this," Josh whispered, pressing a hand lightly to her shoulder. Olivia echoed the sentiment with a simple, "You belong here." When it was finally her turn, Emily stepped onto the stage, guided only by the soft sound of her own footsteps and the distant shuffle of the audience. The auditorium was much larger than the school's, and the weight of the silence before she began was heavier than ever. She could almost feel the skepticism in the air. A blind girl standing alone with a violin, ready to compete against the best young musicians in the state. But Emily was not the same girl who had trembled under Mr. Collins's gaze on her first day. She was not the girl who hesitated in fear. She had lived through the humiliation, the exclusion, the quiet whispers of doubt. And now, standing under the grand lights with nothing but the music ahead of her, she stood still, letting all of it fall away. As she began to play, the music unfolded, not as a performance, but as a confession. The melody carried every ounce of her journey, the grief of losing her father, the isolation in Maplewood, the cruel remarks of Mr. Collins, the secret rehearsals, the discovery of her own strength. Every note resonated with intention, every phrase with a delicate balance of sorrow and hope. The judges, seated stiffly moments before, now leaned forward in silence. The audience, filled with strangers, teachers, and competitors alike, sat spellbound. Emily's playing was not technically perfect. There were tiny imperfections that only a trained ear might detect, but the emotion was undeniable. Each note spoke. It mourned, it healed, it hoped. Emily could feel the air shift. She could not see it, but she could sense the stillness, the collective holding of breath as the auditorium surrendered to the story she was telling. And when the last note faded into the cavernous hall, leaving behind only silence, Emily stood motionless, listening. The eruption of applause that followed was not immediate. It took the audience a heartbeat to return from where the music had taken them, but when it came, it was overwhelming. A standing ovation swept through the room. Teachers wiped tears. Discreetly, fellow competitors applauded without reservation, and even the stern-faced judges stood, visibly moved. Emily bowed with calm grace, and though she could not see the faces before her, she could hear everything she needed to. The applause was not just noise, it was understanding, acceptance, and admiration. Backstage, Josh and Olivia enveloped her in a warm, silent embrace. No words were necessary. The triumph was complete. Emily's mother wept quietly, overwhelmed by pride and love. What none of them expected was to find Mr. Collins standing at the edge of the backstage curtain. He approached slowly, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Parker," he began, voice lower and softer than Emily had ever heard. "You were extraordinary." He struggled with the words as if speaking a language he had long forgotten. "I was wrong," he added plainly. Emily tilted her head slightly, processing the weight of the moment. For the first time, Mr. Collins's words were stripped of pride and condescension. They were genuine. "Thank you," she said simply. No resentment, no bitterness, only quiet acknowledgement. In the days that followed, Emily's life shifted once again. News of her performance reached local papers, and soon she was invited to perform at community events, school concerts, and small-town festivals. Mr. Collins, though never effusive, offered his guidance without hesitation whenever asked. He no longer saw a student to be corrected, but a musician worthy of respect. Josh remained by her side, supporting and encouraging her without ever seeking the spotlight. Olivia continued to be her loyal friend, organizing small recitals and helping her navigate the growing attention. Emily's mother, now her fiercest advocate, made sure every invitation, every new opportunity was approached thoughtfully, never letting the whirlwind distract Emily from why she began in the first place. And yet perhaps the most important change was not in how others saw her, but in how Emily saw herself. She no longer feared the stage, the judgment, or even the uncertainties of the future. She had learned that music did not need sight, it needed heart. And Emily's heart was full. Maplewood never forgot the girl who once walked its halls quietly, unseen, because now whenever she played everyone listened, not because they pitied her, not because they were surprised, but because her music simply could not be ignored. As Emily stood once more on the stage of her school months later, performing at the request of Principal Dawson for a special event, she felt no nerves, no weight of expectation, only joy. And as the final note of her song filled the room, she smiled, knowing that this was not an end but merely the first true beginning of her story. She was Emily Parker, a musician, a storyteller, and nothing, not blindness, not doubt, not even loss, could ever silence her again. As the applause filled the room one more time, Emily knew she had found exactly where she belonged, and this was only the beginning.